following half hour is devoted to the process of teaching and learning at the University of Connecticut. It will highlight the talents of the best of the faculty through the activities of the university's teaching fellows who have been recognized for their excellence by their peers and students. This program, presented by the Institute for Teaching and Learning, invites you to enter the offices, classrooms, and laboratories of these educators of Connecticut's future leaders. Hello, I'm Keith Barker, and host of Focus on Teaching and Learning, and the director of the Institute for Teaching and Learning here at the University of Connecticut. I have with me David Miller, professor of psychology. David, you've spent 22 years here at UConn. What keeps you excited about being in the classroom?
Well, it's definitely the students. The students keep me going. It's their energy, their eagerness to learn, my ability to hopefully try to help them learn using new technologies. Also, the challenge of presenting new information to them, especially with respect to the courses that I teach, which have meaning in popular culture like psychology and animal behavior, and trying to get them to realize that psychology is not what they see on Dr. Phil, for example, or that animal behavior is not what they see on a typical nature program, and trying to get them to really view these things as the sciences that they are as we view them at a major research university.
One of the things I asked a number of students a few years ago was, what are the attributes of a faculty member that help them learn? And their answer was behavior and attitude, and not knowledge. Why do you think this is the case?
I think the attitude of the professor is really crucial. You have to kind of set the scene. You have to create an atmosphere that fosters learning rather than stifles learning. And I think one of the most important aspects of that is being very enthusiastic about what it is you're lecturing about, having a passion for the material, even if deep down inside you're covering material that you might not be very passionate about, making it at least appear that way. And if you can convey that enthusiasm, it can be very infectious, and that'll get your students interested in it too. So I think just by creating that kind of an atmosphere is enough to foster the learning of the information that'll come along down the line.
And building a rapport with students obviously is I think, critical. Right. And you have to do it in large classes. How do you do it?
Yeah, that's difficult, but it's very challenging, and I think I've stumbled upon various things that work. For example, I try to remove as many psychological barriers and physical barriers as possible. Physical barriers like not standing behind the desk, like moving around the classroom as much as possible. Not reading from notes that are prepared. In terms of psychological barriers, trying to get them to realize that I am interested in what they're interested in, and I have to kind of force myself to do that. I delve into popular culture. I find out what they are into these days and try to take examples of that and relate it to the kinds of concepts that I'm trying to teach, and they appreciate that.
I think so. And you're moving about. I know you use a remote mouse because you use PowerPoint, and right. PowerPoint is your speciality. I think the whole university regards that as your speciality. But pedagogically, how do you think it fits in with your teaching and their learning? Okay.
Well, I use PowerPoint quite differently than the way that a lot of people use PowerPoint. I think I probably did start out like most people have done, and that's just transfer lecture notes into PowerPoint, bulleted item by bulleted item. The problem with that is that students tend to just copy every word that they see on the screen, and they're not listening to what the professor is saying, and that's not what we want to have them do. So over the years, I have been reorganizing my PowerPoint material, getting rid of as much textual information as possible, and incorporating digitized multimedia, video clips that I've re-edited, that I've oftentimes actually added a new soundtrack to. Scanned images, I have thousands of scanned images that I even re-edit those using Photoshop and related packages, and sounds, things that I can use to convey the kinds of concepts I'm trying to get them to understand, but not in words, so that they'll actually listen to me while I'm speaking, that they'll take notes the way they would as if I was not using PowerPoint, and then PowerPoint becomes a useful tool to hopefully foster learning and remembering, rather than turning them into photocopy machines.
He has an enormous repertoire of multimedia techniques and capabilities that he has spent hours learning, improving upon.
Well, I think Dave's use of PowerPoint is extraordinary, and one of the things that he's used to make his lectures in psychology stunning. He puts incredible amounts of time into these things. Probably for a given lecture, he'll put anywhere of 10 to 30 hours. He develops extraordinary animations and beautiful transitions. He digitizes short movie clips and puts those into his animations, into his PowerPoint slides.
People call him the king of PowerPoint, and he really is. He's excellent at using the PowerPoint.
There's been no known inhibitory role discovered for it yet, which is not to say it doesn't have one. I just said that there was no known inhibitory role discovered for it yet. Because originally we thought that things like GABA.
One thing David does that I think works very well is he walks around a lot. Now he's using PowerPoint presentations, so his computer is down on the desk, but he has a remote control device in his hand, so he can switch slides from anywhere in the room. And he uses this very effectively by walking around and literally getting close to the students in almost any part of this large room, letting them see him as a real person, making sure they don't just see him as somebody standing down behind the podium.
It really makes you feel like you're part of the lecture, and it really, again, it creates a very informal, a very relaxed atmosphere, and it really helps you to learn as much as, and makes you feel like you're not as much of just an observer, but rather that you're really part of the classroom. And that's difficult to do in a classroom that's so big like he teaches.
He'll have everything in his head all planned out like he rehearsed it the night before, like he's a stand-up comedian, he's just doing material. And he knows very much everything he's talking about because he's very good about, when someone asks a question, he'll be right on top of it, and he knows.
He puts a lot of thought into how he's going to organize his lectures, and he lets students in on that organization before the class. So he will publish his PowerPoint notes, so students have an idea of what's coming.
Somebody else looks, even if you're an identical twin. Hey, identical twins have the same gene.
He wants the students to take notes, but he wants them also to have a clear sense of where things are going and not to have to write down every single thing. So he organizes his PowerPoint presentations, and then he prepares for the students a notebook that the students actually buy before the semester begins, in which all of his lecture outlines are present as PowerPoint slides, and yet there's lots of space for them to fill in during the lecture. So this is one way he keeps them clear about where they are, at the same time gives them some tasks to fulfill.
It's basically like a general outline of his presentation, and it allows the student that he can basically fill in the blanks, and he can listen to what Dr. Miller's talking about without just trying to, furiously write down everything. So the student can really listen and absorb what's being taught and make the most sense of it.
David, I've talked to a number of teaching fellows and students about teaching fellows, and I think the most common element that comes up every time we talk about it is humor. Every one of our best teachers uses humor in some way. Tell us a little bit about how you use humor.
I use humor to try to elaborate points that I'm interested in them learning. Sometimes being able to link up some difficult concept with a humorous event can actually foster both the understanding of the concept as well as remembering what that concept happens to be. Yeah. And I'll often delve into popular culture to obtain sources of humor from TV programs, South Park, for example, things that I know that they're watching. Of course, that means I have to watch it too, and I have to find little bits and pieces to edit, and it's actually gotten to be quite infectious. I enjoy doing this quite a bit, and then figuring out a clever way to link this to the concept that I'm trying to convey without distracting from the concept, because humor for humor's sake is no good. It has to be content relevant and has to foster learning. So I do that, and I'm really quite gratified when students will come back to me either in the same semester or in many cases years later and tell me, remember that clip you showed from South Park? And to this day, I remember how the laws of learning work because you linked it up to that clip and it helped me in this other course that I took. I find that really exciting that it was able to have that effect. Moreover, it fosters communication. It opens up channels of communication. It shows them that I'm interested in what they're interested in. And I think that's a key in terms of the learning process.
And in a similar vein, I'm often asked, particularly by teaching assistants, well, you know, KB, you use humor in your classes. How can I use it? What would be your answer to helping other people using humor?
For a first-timer, I would say ease into it very gradually and very thoughtfully. Be very careful of the kind of humor that you use. Clearly, there are some forms of humor that would always be inappropriate, even if they help you make a point. Just those need to be avoided altogether. Some people have a hard time pulling off humor. There's nothing more pathetic than watching a stand-up comic fall flat on his face on the stage. And if you're the kind of professor who has a personality that it just doesn't convey humor very well, then probably one should not go that route. It's one size does not fit all in terms of teaching style. So I'd encourage people to try it if they felt comfortable with it, if they felt it was helping them pedagogically. If they found that it was not helping them pedagogically and certainly distracting their students, to just try something differently.
And in fact, talking to the students and finding out whether it's working or not is probably a good technique as well.
That's right. And they'll let you know. They let me know all the time, usually in a very positive way, which is very cool.
He's not just reading off a PowerPoint presentation. He's not just reading you information from a book. He's illustrating it in different ways. He's talking about it from his own personal experience. He seems to make it very relevant to, I don't know, your daily life, and he makes sure that he adds things into it that make it connect, I guess, with maybe your own personality or your own, you know, interests.
That's one of the most effective strategies he has. He also is very funny, and he works humor into his lectures a lot so that the students are always amused and entertained. And I think the entertainment value keeps the students wanting to come back for more. Even though he teaches the 8 o'clock class, he gets phenomenally good turnout.
And for David, his humor comes from him, and that's what makes it so effective, I think. I don't think that David or any other good teaching fellow will stand up in front of a class and try to be funny. The humor is spontaneous, and there is humor in psychology and humor in the material that David is trying to present.
Anyway, Hannibal, but not Hannibal Lecter. Danny Glover, Rodney King. What do these folks have in common? They're all what? They're all on my screen, yes, but that's not what I'm fishing for, but you're right.
He will find things that make you laugh, that are unexpected. He keeps students constantly on the edge of their seats with interest because they never know what to expect next.
Sometimes he'll put a funny picture to illustrate some concept on the board that either is disturbing or kind of sick looking or whatever, but usually he always puts something funny. He'll use clips from different TV shows that we know that he likes, and usually those clips always illustrate the whatever concept he's going over, but they're just really funny.
While they're very funny, they're also very relevant to what he's teaching. And this really creates a really relaxed general atmosphere, and it allows the student to really learn and get the most out of the class.
He'll explain, you know, some kind of relevance to where they come from, but so if he puts like 3 clips maybe in each lecture, that gets us laughing, that gets us interested, so then we're there, so the next thing he talks about, we're not sleeping, or we're not, you know, talking to our neighbor. Usually he'll get us involved first, and then he'll explain what was the relevance of whatever he was doing.
If you can motivate a student to be interested on their own in class material, they will learn so much more than you could possibly teach them. And so I think that's what David does. He motivates students, or he gets students motivated. And how he does that, quite frankly, is not through the technology, but it's through his own motivation. David gets very, very excited about psychology, about teaching psychology to other folks. And that excitement comes through the minute you walk into one of his classrooms, and it persists throughout that particular class. And that sort of excitement can be very, very contagious. And so David's secret is not that he teaches students, but he motivates them to learn.
David, of all the teaching fellows that I've interviewed and talked to, you probably
prepare as much as any of them. And I think that's very important as far as our delivery is concerned. But I think what you also do is make it very clear what your learning objectives are and hence what the students' expectations are. How do you go about that? How do you rationalize that with what you're trying to teach? And how do you help the students understand what it means to be successful in your class?
In order to do that, I try to spell things out very clearly, and basically there are two different classes of learning objectives that I have in mind that I lay out very early in the semester. One is what I would call the how-to objectives, how to do well with this material, how to understand the material. What do you, as a student, need to do to make the transition from high school, since most of my students are freshmen, to the demands of the scholarship that's conveyed in a major research university. And the other classification of objectives are the actual content objectives. So going back to the how-to objectives, I create a student manual that's custom published. It's over 300 pages long, and that gets published twice a year because I teach the course twice a year. The first 30 some odd pages of that contain nothing but course policy, my expectations of them. A good chunk of that are testimonials from students that have done well in previous semesters who I invite to write these anonymous blurbs about how they went about it. I tell my students how I would recommend going about it, but how I do it is not necessarily the best way for everybody. So now they hear from me how I would do it, but they can also read 20 some odd blurbs from previous students that really did very well in the course and how they went about doing it. So the students have told me they found these guidelines very, very helpful. So that's in terms of the how to perform well objectives. The content objectives, on day one, I lay out various goals that I have in terms of what I hope to accomplish this semester in the course. As we go through the course, I always go back to those goals. Whenever I talk about something that in some way relates to one or more of those goals, I point it out. And then at the end of the semester, I reiterate what those goals were and show them how I think we actually accomplished those goals, and then hope that we actually did.
There's a number of reasons why you become a professor, but certainly in David's case, one of the reasons is that it gives him an opportunity to help students to get to be where they want to be, to learn, in this case, about psychology. But he truly cares about their well-being.
I had a relative die when I was taking his course, and I knew it wasn't like a big deal to go tell him because I could always get notes from someone else or something like that. But I didn't know because I didn't know if, that'd be a problem or something. So I went up and I told him, and the first thing he said, first of all, I'm sorry to hear about that.
Dr. Miller actually went out of his way to make sure that that I was taken care of and that I was registered for all the courses that I needed to be. And he spoke with certain teachers, making sure that I can get into the right courses. And I found that it was tremendous that he was willing to put that kind of effort in for one of his students.
That kind of caring shows up in his worrying about his advisees and are they getting the right courses for their particular needs. He put something together for our department. It was called 7 Steps to Good Advising, and the whole department uses that now. When somebody does something like that, 7 Steps to Good Advising, and 7 pieces of advice for a good advisee, that's a true indication of really caring about what education is about. And what education is about, in David's view, is getting students to where they want to be, not necessarily to where you think they ought to be, but to be where they want to be. And he does that in a number of forms.
He spends a lot of time preparing materials that are so thorough. I think the students realize students are pretty good judges of when an instructor is putting in overtime to help them. And Dave is one of the people on his campus, one of the few people who really prepares materials of such extraordinary depth and richness that I think students understand that.
He is willing to share what he knows, even to help folks with what he knows, without limitation. So, for example, he offers workshops at least every semester, maybe more often, in our department.
Is to do exactly what I'm doing now. I teach with Multimedia, PowerPoint, which is what I'm using now, but I also use a remote mouse. So I don't stand in front. I'm walking all over the room so that the students in back don't feel like they're not getting the same attention as the students in front. And that's kind of a good thing to do because, especially in a room this size.
On a one-to-one basis, he's taken many people like myself and sat down with us for an hour, 2 hours, just to answer questions we might have about how to do some of the things he does with PowerPoint. With him, it's not a question of doing enough. It's a question of doing the best you could possibly do. I think he's a perfectionist, and it shows in the way his lectures are organized and come off. I've talked to a number of students that have come to my class and turned out they've taken his class, and they, without exception, they rave about the quality and the enthusiasm that he brings to his classes, and just the enjoyment they got out of psychology with David Miller.
When we teach, we don't do it in isolation, clearly, and it's important to find out from our students what's going on and to help us improve. How do you collect, or how do you assume some feedback from your students, and what do you do with it?
Well, of course, we have the standard course evaluations at the end of the semester, and those are somewhat helpful. I prefer the written part of those evaluations where students actually have a chance to express themselves in writing rather than just filling in bubbles on a bubble sheet on a scale from 1 to 10. But in addition to that, throughout the semester, I focus a lot on emails. I spend a lot of time with emails. In a class with 315 students, that usually means 20 to 40 emails from students a day. But I think that's really important. It may just be answering a simple query. It might be more than that. It might be students seeking advice about how to do well in the class or other issues. I give those emails top priority. As soon as I get one of those emails, I answer it on the spot. And you know what? Students are really appreciative of that. So often I'll get an instant email back saying, oh my God, you know, I'm one of 300 some odd students and you took the time to answer me. Wow, that's great. And yeah, I guess it is, but I think it's very important. And I think it also fosters communication to let them know, yeah, I do care about you, which I really do, and I'm willing to talk to you as an individual despite the fact that there are so many students here. So emails, I have access to certain discussion lists that students write about, and sometimes I'm able to clarify certain things, whether it be about me or some other course that I know about, so I give feedback there as well and appreciate their feedback in turn. I find their feedback, for me in particular, very, very helpful, and I pay close attention to it. Occasionally you get an off-the-wall comment from somebody that obviously has a gripe about something, but that's fine. A lot of times those also are very legitimate. And I use these comments as a guide for me in terms of what am I doing right in terms of teaching this class, in getting the material across to them, as well as what am I doing wrong, what needs improvement, and I focus more on that. Most of the what am I doing right comments have something to do with multimedia, humor, and all of these other things that I'm apparently notorious for. The what am I doing wrong comments I find very helpful. I pace around the room too much, things like this. So, you know, try not to do these things. If they're finding it distracting enough to remember to put on an evaluation at the end of the semester, then it's probably something that needs to be attended to. So I try to do that.
You say the students appreciate the advice you give them and vice versa. In terms of a mentorship, of your professionalism, your way that you have learned to teach in the way that you have now, who have been your strongest mentors?
Oh, the way at the top is my graduate advisor, Dr. Robert Tallarico, University of Miami. He's now retired. This is a man, and maybe I was lucky because I was his only graduate student at the time, who spent 2 hours plus with me in his office every day just talking about science and related issues. And I found that to be such an invaluable experience, and it's had a big effect on me because I try to spend as much time with my students, both graduate and undergraduates, as I possibly can on a one-on-one basis. Here at the University of Connecticut, you have had a big influence on me because of our mutual interests in the use of technology. But I don't want to embarrass you, so I won't dwell on that. But another one of our colleagues and teaching fellows, Thomas Terry, in molecular and cell biology, is somebody that I am frequently consulting with, even that we employ very different technologies. He's a web person and I'm a PowerPoint person, but we have an awful lot in common, and I think we feed off one another a lot in terms of that. In my own department, my department head, Skip Lowe, has had a big influence on me just in terms of his teaching style, his enthusiasm, his letting down all guard in trying to get his points across to students. Some of my own graduate students that have been teachers, one in particular, Charles Blach, who now has an honorary chair at Wabash College in Indiana, has had a profound influence on my own teaching style back when he was here. And finally, one other person, Ernie Zaraxadeh, a political science professor. Because of his demeanor, his enthusiasm, his whole manner, I have found myself consciously and unconsciously imitating him recently. And I just find his whole style so engaging as he communicates with everybody, not just students, but colleagues in general.
If I ask you in a single sentence, what advice would you give to new faculty who wanted to be good instructors, good teachers? What would that advice be? Number
one point in big capital letters would be relax. It's going to take time. Nobody is a born teacher, at least that's how I feel. It's something that you learn as you practice. You go along, you get better. Relax, but also prepare. As much as one prepares, you're probably still not prepared enough. And that's something that one would encounter as soon as one steps foot in the classroom and sees what's really going on. I think it's impossible to over-prepare, so that too is very important. Also be very receptive to student feedback, because that's your focal group. That's your audience, as it were. That's your target group. And if they're not getting what you're trying to give them, that means you'll need to try to do something differently. So I think being open to feedback, try new things all the time. Go with what works for you. And don't do whatever doesn't work for you. What works for one professor will not necessarily work for another professor. So be open to all kinds of influences, but relax.
And thank you, David.
Thank you, Keith.
Well, I hope you've learned from the faculty and the students that we've listened to today. I hope at some point in time I'll be able to introduce to you another teaching fellow from the University of Connecticut.